My name's Cameron Brown. I'm the chairman of the local history society. We own this museum. But I'm rather concerned and pleased to say that this gentleman here, John Slatford, was one of the founders of this society 50 years ago and knows an awful lot more about Ripley than I ever will.
I do know.
So if I can't answer the question, there's someone here I can turn to answer it for us. Let me give you a little bit of background here before we start, or as we start. The next village over is Send, and Ripley was originally part of Send. There's a reference to Send in an Anglo-Saxon charter of the mid-900s, and Send has a pretty sizable entry in the Domesday Book. Ripley, however, is only mentioned in writing at the end of the 12th century, and we'll tell you more about that as we go around. The name of Ripley is probably a Saxon name. I studied this sort of thing at university, and I think it was a Saxon name. A ripel in Old English was a strip of land, but it could be a corruption of somebody's name. There quite often are, because Lee at the end generally simply means a clearing in the woodlands, though E at the end is Norse for an island, like Chelsea or Battersea or Bermondsey. It's a roadside village, a long road with nearly all the houses at either side of the road, which often indicates it was first built up in Roman times. They tended to do that rather than grouping it around a church or a marketplace. And interestingly, it was shown on Britain's first ever road map, Gough's map of 1360, which shows Ripley on the road. Now, the development of Ripley is really associated with road travel. You got the main road from London to Winchester, which was the head of the main place of the church, through to Portsmouth, going that way, and you had the links to various monasteries going north and south. And indeed, the whole development up until the mid-16th century was to do with religion. It was to do with the establishment of the monasteries. In the London direction, you had an Augustinian monastery at Merton. Down that way, you had Winchester, very important seat of the church. Up that way, you had the Benedictine monastery, which was founded in Chertsey in the mid-7th century. And down the other way, you had the Cistercian monastery, 12th century Cistercian monastery, out near Farnham. Here, we had the Augustinians. The Augustinians came at the beginning of the 12th century, and we will see what they first built. That'll be the last thing we visit on the way around. But around 1190, they were given the land on which to build a much larger priory, which the ruins of which you still see if you drive down from Purford Woking direction, down Newark Lane, and it's Newark Priory. The Augustinians were a pretty outgoing bunch. They went and talked to people, unlike Cistercians who like to hide themselves away in the middle of nowhere. And so a community built up really to look after the priory, local tradesmen, local farmers, and so on, supplying them, until Henry VIII decided to shut them all down in this case in 1539. The next 200 years of Ripley's growth were really derived from the navy. The fact that this was the main road down to Portsmouth. You had Henry VIII on the throne, you had Elizabeth I. They all loved jumping in ships and firing guns at people, whether it was the Dutch or the French or the Spanish. And this, of course, was a hugely important communications route. And so you had the whole service industry of the pubs and inns and supplying. You can imagine the roads were pretty hideous in those days. Unsurfaced roads. Guildford to London, would take a day. Until in the mid-17th century, someone had the bright idea of licensing turnpikes or toll roads, with the proceeds of those tolls going to maintaining and improving the roads. And in 1749, the local Turnpike Act for here was passed, and we got a turnpike up where the Jovial Sailor pub is now, down this road going towards Guildford on your left-hand side. There had been one around Esher before that, around Kingston before that, but we were still stuck at the muddy end of the road. Once that came in, they were able to spend money on the road, and basically there was a huge number of stagecoaches came through, and the stagecoach business meant the pubs and the coach houses and so on had lots and lots of trade, and money could be spent on keeping the road up. So at that point, we're saying we became part of what they called polite Surrey, which meant that nice people could come here because the road wasn't all muddy, and the town began to grow, the village began to grow. Post houses developed. There was one in Kingston, there was one in Esher, there was one here, which we will visit on our way around. And at its peak, we were up to 17 coaches a day going through this town, doing around 10 miles an hour. 1850s, all changed because the railways came. And the local laird did not want those noisy railways coming through here. It's a bad decision. Because that almost killed off this village. The railway went instead to Woking, to the north of here, and after Woking through to Portsmouth, and on the other side it went through Effingham and down to Guildford, and suddenly there was one coach a day again because people were using the railways. And this town really nearly did die, but was actually saved by a hobby, and that hobby was cycling. And those of you who've popped in will see we've got an exhibition on at the moment about the cycling. By the late sort of third quarter of the 19th century, bicycles were affordable, and the middle classes certainly were turning it into a hobby and riding bicycles, for their weekends. In 1869 here, they finally macadammed the main road. That's not tar macadam. The original macadaming process was just crushing up stones and putting the stones into the surface and letting the weight of the traffic compress them and break them down and so on. But it was good enough for cyclists to come on. And suddenly you could reach here and get back in a day from London. And so this became a destination. And a lot of pubs, as we'll talk about as we go around, welcome the cyclists. There's a police report in 1894. On Whit Sunday, the police estimated that 20,000 cyclists passed through Ripley on one day, which is almost as much as we got when the Olympics were on a few years ago. So they got tarmacked in 1907. Macadam all the way to Portsmouth by the 1920s, and suddenly you could do Portsmouth in a day instead of Guildford to London in a day. From sort of into the 20th century, and one of the things that kept this village going was the antiques trade. It was very reachable from London and outside, and it specialised in early English oak furniture, and its only competition was Dorking and the Cotswolds. I happen to know quite a lot about that because we collect early English furniture, and we used to come here 40 or 50 years ago when we were first married and bought furniture here. They've all gone now. And they're all gone because in 1975, John and all the other locals welcomed the building of a bypass to make the village quieter. And it did make the village quieter to the point where all the antique shops closed. It took them a while, and there is one left, but I wonder for how much longer. And in 1984, the M25 came. And now it is, like many Surrey villages here, it's a mix of commuting and local agriculture and small businesses, and manages quite well.